Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming to our chat today. Thankful that Maureen was gracious enough to join us as well for a little conversation about some beer history. Before we get started, on all of the Zooms that we've been doing and all the Zooms that I've been participating in, or all these virtual events that happen, it seems that the thing to do is to share what everyone's drinking. Peter, you're probably drinking coffee in Australia, right? You can't speak. Sorry. I won't ask you questions. So I am just pouring myself. I've got a beer called Market Rate from Off Color Brewing. It's a wild ale that's aged in wine barrels and has a little strawberry in it.
Oh, well, I am drinking a Northeast, which is made by Grain Belt, which is owned by August Shell Brewing Company, which is the family that is the centerpiece of the book I'm writing right now. And I love this beer. To me, it is like the perfect mix of malt and hops, and made by my buddy Dave Berg, the brewmaster at Shell. So, cheers.
Awesome. Cheers. Cheers, everybody. And please feel free to share what you're drinking in the comments so we can have a look that way.
I just learned this. So you can go down and do the chat thing at the bottom of your screens if you want to chime in, even though you're all muted, because we live. Oh, there we go.
Hey, Rudy. Ooh, I love me Maggie from Metropolitan.
Wow. Whoa.
Hop
wow.
Culture.
Okay, I'm drinking a real
IPA. What else did I miss? Revolution.
Hop
Nice.
Culture.
Boulevard. Nice. Awesome. Okay, well, today we're gonna chat, like I said, a little bit about beer history here. Maureen Ogle, I discovered her book many years ago and got right into it. And I had been really researching tavern history and then alcohol history and beer history beginning really around 2000. And when I found Maureen's book, I was just immediately a fan. It was such an important book, Ambitious Brew, for really, I want to say, it really kind of got people extremely interested in beer history. So her work was pivotal in sort of setting the stage for what now is sort of a career that people kind of are able to pursue, which is, back when I was doing this, it was sort of like, what are you doing? That's just dumb.
Right.
It's not a thing, right? Beer dumbs down history and alcohol dumbs down this history, and all you want to do is drink all day and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So your book was so essential to really a lot of where we are now with looking at beer history and beer culture.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, I loved it. And of course, through the world of social media and the Twitterverse, we are able to connect. And then again, thankfully for the Brewseum, Maureen was also a part of our very first beer culture summit, which happened.
Incredible. In my wildest dreams, I never, ever imagined something like that. I was just, it knocked me over. It was amazing.
It was a great 4 days of
It was
intense beer history and culture.
Yes.
But before we get started in the whole chat about 1933 and what happened on this day and sort of the days leading up to it, how did you get into beer history, and how did you get to the point where you wanted to write Ambitious Brew?
All right. Here's the very short but genuinely true answer. I was in academia, and in 1999 I left and decided to write history for the rest of us instead of for 6 people who were interested in my specialty. And so I sort of wrote my test run book, which is a history of Key West. And then once that book had just come out, this was in, I guess, 2002, that book had just come out. And I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I already knew from long practice that if I just wait, my brain will tell me what to write about. So one day I was driving down the street in Des Moines, where I live north of Des Moines in Iowa. And I was going to a Italian grocery store that has been there for 100 years. And I was I was thinking about grocery stores 100 years ago. You know, I was just ruminating basically on nothing except driving to this grocery store, and about 2 blocks in front of me, I saw a red truck pull up to a stop sign and then cross. So it was going across my line of vision. It was a big, shiny, very clean red truck, and it had one word on it, Budweiser. And literally in the middle of Jackson Avenue in Des Moines, Iowa, my brain said, write a book about beer. So I went home, and after I got my groceries, I went home, and the first thing I thought was, well, surely this has been done to death, right? It has to have been done to death. And I was astounded to discover it hadn't really been done at all. There was a book that came out in 1962, and it's a very good book to start with, but it didn't really have a lot of analysis, and it was a little ahistorical for my taste. So that's how I decided to do this, and the rest, no pun intended, is history. And so I fell into this. I literally, when I saw the truck, I didn't even know if Budweiser was the name of a company or a brand or what. I didn't drink beer, hadn't had beer for years at that point. So I wish I had a really deep, profound intellectual answer, but that's how it happened.
Well, that's interesting that you didn't really even drink beer.
No.
And I feel like that's sometimes how the way it goes, right? I always say my not so secret, dirty little secret is that I drink more wine than beer.
Well, there you go. I think, well, I will say that what I realized as I got into it, as I had found out with my 2 previous books that I had written, that for me, not knowing anything really works to my advantage. I didn't know anything. Literally, I didn't know how beer was made. I didn't know what was in it. I didn't know anything about its history. And that's not, I mean, in some ways, it's a really stupid way to start a book.
Right.
Because you're kind of like inventing a wheel. And that's why books that I write tend to take so long. But I have no regrets. It changed my life in a lot of really good ways to write that book.
Well, I think it changed a lot of people's way of thinking in a lot of ways. So
I hope.
So cheers to that. Okay, so talking about April 6th and 7th, 1933.
Yes.
You know, historians love to talk about history, right? And I always say we have to start with the history of the history, right? So can you give us just an overview of what the late 19th century, early 20th century American brewing industry looked like?
Sure. And so I'm going to focus on the period from 1890 to 1917. In the 1890s, I meant to look these numbers up and I forgot, so just they're not going to be exact. But there were about 3,000 beer makers in the US. There were a handful of big shipping brewers, and then there were a few regional brewers. Nobody really had a truly nationwide market. The breweries ranged from the largest one in the world down to one that, like August Shell Brewing in New Ulm, Minnesota, which was a small country brewery is what they were called, serving a mostly rural area, very small potatoes compared to Anheuser-Busch. A lot of breweries were owned by foreign investors. There were a lot of syndicate brewers that consisted of brewers that merged, especially in the 1890s, because there was a massive economic collapse in the United States in the 1890s, and it was the only way to survive. So that was the story generally. But things changed quite dramatically. That by 1910, that structure had begun to fall apart because of not constitutional prohibition. The 18th Amendment hadn't been passed, but by 1910, half of Americans already lived under some form of prohibition. And the result was that hundreds and hundreds of brewers went out of business because they legally couldn't do their job anymore. And others went out of business because as more and more states and locale counties and towns went dry, the brewers who could tried to move into other markets. So there was just this incredible crunch. And here's the number I wish I had looked up, by about 1915 or 16, there were only about 700 or 800 breweries left. And Brewing, here's where I have to look up a date because I'm like every historian. I cannot remember dates. Don't criticize me for it, please. Don't judge me. The United States got into World War I, and that became the great accelerant on this prohibition movement that was going across the entire country. And in December 1917, Woodrow Wilson ordered the amount of grain available to brewers and distillers both significantly reduced, and that the beer could only contain 2.75% alcohol by weight. And naturally, that pushed more brewers out of business. And then in 1918, in late 1918, wartime prohibition was imposed. And then shortly after that, the 18th Amendment started going through the state ratification process. And basically, it was all over with by December 1918, which is, quick, do some math, 2 years before prohibition actually,
Right.
2 years, a year and a half before the 18th Amendment was actually ratified. So there was this, fairly complicated, and I should say large industry in the 1890s. It employed a lot of people. Its capital value was immense. It was one of the 10 largest industries in the country. And then the rug was just pulled out from under it.
So I want to talk a little bit about the 18th Amendment and really kind of how that all came to be, and sort of the push for that. And I always, when I often get asked to talk about prohibition, the one thing I always start it with is, most people have always, throughout history, there's always been someone in the background saying, don't do that, right? No matter where you are in the world, no matter what time period it is, there's always a Debbie Downer, if you will. And temperance, of course, had been around for a solid century before actually prohibition happened. So there was always some sort of anti-alcohol sentiments lingering throughout our very young nation. For most of our history. But 18th Amendment, give us a little bit of background. How does it come to be, and set the stage for us there?
Well, again, this was something I didn't really know anything about prohibition until I wrote this book. So I had to kind of do a crash course in it. So I was honestly, genuinely surprised how it came about. As Liz just said, there has always been, especially since the 1820s, for the past 200 years, there's been a very strong and formally and informally organized effort to prevent Americans from drinking as much, to put as many barriers between Americans and alcohol as possible. And that ratcheted dramatically in the 1890s with the organization of a group called the Anti-Saloon League. And I was astounded to discover how politically sophisticated this group was. If there is a godfather of political action committees in the US, they're it. They are the font from which everything else came. They came up with a very basic strategy, which was get as many people at the city, county, even precinct and ward level, get them on board so that they will in turn vote into office at the state level, forget the federal level.
Right.
And city councils, people who would establish bans on places to buy alcohol in particular. It was called the Anti-Saloon League because in their mind, the rationale was if you shut down the saloons, then the brewers weren't going to have any place to sell their beer. So it made sense, but their political strategy was start at the city, get people on board and ban booze and close saloons in a town or city. Then get people elected to the state legislature so that they can in turn impose more barriers, more prohibition. And they didn't even think about trying to do anything national. That was their very, very long-term goal, very long-term. By 1913, they succeeded, did I get that year right? Yes. In 1913, two things happened that really shoved this process of drawing up the country into the federal level for the first time. One was that the 16th Amendment was ratified. That's the one that gives us the income tax. for decades, the Treasury had been extremely dependent on taxes coming from alcohol, especially the brewers. And now that wasn't going to be necessary anymore. And the other thing it did was, in effect, pass a bill that banned, very much simplifying this, banned the interstate commerce of beer, so that, you know, if you brewed in St. Louis or Milwaukee or Chicago and Iowa had banned alcohol, you couldn't ship beer into that state. So interstate commerce got into it. And that was the same year that the Anti-Saloon League decided to do basically a trial run. They wrote what, if in effect, would later become the text of the 18th Amendment and sent it to Congress. They just wanted to see what happened. And it came horrifyingly close to being passed by the House, which they didn't expect. They were really trying to test their political power, because I think this is a thing most people don't know. At that time, United States senators were elected by state legislatures. So again, if you could get control of a state legislature, you could definitely get control in the Senate. And of course, if you got control of a state legislature, the odds were pretty high that you would be sending congressional representatives to Congress who agreed with your views. So they built this extremely powerful machine, starting local and then building it bigger and bigger. And their hope in 1913 was that sometime in the next 20 years, it would be possible to get a prohibition amendment through and get it ratified. And that all got accelerated, as I said a few minutes ago, when World War I broke out. It became the perfect moment to point out to a public that by that time, again, most Americans were already living under some form of prohibition. Most Americans actually opposed insobriety, intemperance, drunkenness. They wanted these regulations. The Anti-Saloon League used the war to launch an all-out attack on brewing, first by, which was not hard to do, to convince Congress that the United States should not be wasting good grain and good farmland to make beer. We can't afford this. And they also attacked the brewers themselves, because it was just a fact that virtually all breweries in the United States, except for the ones that were owned by foreign investments, were owned or had been founded by people of German descent. And of course, Germany was the big enemy. So very quickly during World War I, by late 1918, there was wartime prohibition. And in in January of 1919, the states began ratifying the amendment that Congress had passed. And I think the final state to ratify it was in 1919, and it went into effect, this is the date, it was ratified by January 1919, so 1 year after wartime prohibition had been imposed, and it went into effect in mid-January in 1920. So they accomplished this goal that they really thought might take a couple of generations. They managed to pull it off in basically 25 years, which is amazing. Very, very skillful political organization is what got it through. And it never went, by the way, Americans themselves never voted on it. If they'd had that chance, it's unlikely it would have been ratified, but that's not who was voting on it. So there you go.
It's always amazed me how, looking at a lot of these historic records and learning about a lot of these stories from even the 18th century and for sure into the 19th century in our country, how beer has been so political, so politically driven.
Yes.
Yes. It really is unbelievable. And then you think about it too, right? We talk about this whole local situation, right? We got into this, support local movement, but really all of this activity has always been pushed from that local level.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. People, it is just a fact that by the time World War I broke out, a majority of Americans honestly wanted the saloons closed, and they opposed drinking. And that by the way, that complete demonization of alcohol would become a problem for what came to be the brewing industry when Prohibition was finally repealed. It was a chronic problem. You know, most Americans just didn't want to drink anything. And if they did, during Prohibition, they learned how to drink hard liquor.
Yeah.
So
they learned how to drink more.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, there's something amazing about somebody telling you you can't do that and wanting to do it all the more. And we can almost see it here, right, with what's going on around the world. It's like you can't go out, stay at home. And you're like, no, I have every right to go out and do whatever the hell I want, right? It's interesting how you see history repeating itself in so many different ways.
I think in the 1920s, though, don't get me wrong, there was a huge amount of illegal alcohol production, both of beer and hard liquor, and lots of stuff coming in illegal over the border. But I was amazed at just how deep into the DNA of the United States anti-alcohol attitudes were by that time. You know, by the time Prohibition actually went into effect, 2 generations of Americans had grown up, most of them without much access to alcohol. It just really wasn't part of their lives. Real sort of living in an alcoholic wonderland, not alcohol, an alcohol wonderland.
Great time to be alive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's a good overview of the 18th Amendment, which eventually was also called the Volstead Act.
Well, the Volstead Act was I mean, you can ratify amendments until you're blue in the face. But in this case, there also had to be a mechanism for defining what exactly was, what are we making illegal here? And what the Volstead Act did was define the only alcohol beverages that could be sold had 0.5% of alcohol or less. So that's what the Volstead Act did. It set up this machinery for defining what actually it is that we're banning.
And let me, the Volstead Act too, this whole thing about prohibition is that it actually says you cannot produce, distribute, right, sell alcohol, and it says nothing about consumption.
That's right. That's right. That's why
so if I got busted drinking, I'd be in the clear.
Well,
maybe.
Yes. There were definitely, if you were just making homebrew for yourself, the odds of getting busted were about non-existent. But the reality was that there were a lot of people who were making homebrew, for example, say for the people on their block or the people in their neighborhood. But it was true. That's one reason why a lot of people went around and stocked up like crazy, especially for hard liquor, because if you had it, you could drink it. It's just that technically you shouldn't be able to get any after January, whatever, 1920.
Okay, so that nonsense happens in 1920 officially, right?
Yeah.
And so what you touched on this a little bit, but what happens to beer?
What happened to beer? Actually, to think about what happened to beer during Prohibition, we got to go back before Prohibition, because as these Prohibition laws, these bans swept across the continental United States, brewers kept trying to adjust. They were trying to brew beer with less and less alcohol because, for example, some communities would define alcoholic beverage as something that contained more than 2.5% alcohol, or, find a number. So brewers were already trying to figure out what they could use their equipment for, what they could make. And the beer was just becoming less and less and less alcoholic. And by the time Prohibition went into effect, there were already, of the brewers who were still alive, they had switched to making what were called cereal beverages, which were essentially beers with virtually no alcohol in them. And that was supposed to be the great saving grace of the brewing industry in the 1920s, but that lasted about 1.5 years. By 1923, brewers who invested in the cereal beverage market realized that it just wasn't going to fly, not least because Americans really had a lot of other alternatives, most especially they had soft drinks. I mean, they could get illegal booze, but soft drinks had become the thing to sit and sip if you're chatting with people. So the cereal beverage thing, God love the breweries who really tried to do it. And some of them stayed in business. There was a very important one in Chicago called Atlas Brewing. And as the 1920s unfolded and it became clear that this was a big mistake and it wasn't quite clear how to get back out of it, these cereal beverage makers began working Congress pretty hard, showing, look, you know, we can make a beer that will be less lethal than a lot of the alley brew, because people were actually dying from some of the stuff that was being sold illegally. And so they, especially from about 1927, 1928 on, these cereal beverage producers were really trying to explain to Congress, you know, the world's not going to come to an end if, for example, we go back to 2.75 beer. And so the beer, you know, beer just kind of went away because there was not much interest in the cereal beverages and there were other things to drink. And Prohibition really was pretty disastrous, because trying to carry out the machinery in the Volstead Act was quite difficult.
Right.
So the whole thing didn't work very well. But beer, the great tragedy to me was that a lot of intellectual capital was lost. I mean, we lost an entire generation of beer makers. Brewing lost an entire generation of advances, you know, thinking about things like yeast, building new kinds of technologies for brewing, which the science and technology of brewing was changing very dramatically from about 1900 to 1915, and all of that just got lost. I mean, all these brewers, these skilled brewers that, you know, there that went. It just all went away. It was lost forever. Well, not forever, but close to it.
Sure. Would you say it's a fair assumption or a fair statement that the bigger breweries were able to survive because they had a larger infrastructure already? They were able to make some of these alternative beverages or alternative liquids or products?
Yes and no. By the time the amendment actually went into effect, I think there were about 500 breweries left, and most of them that when cereal beverage did not turn out to be, you know, the thing that was going to save them, many of them shifted to making soft drinks. And at the time, the soft drink market was way more local than it is now. You know, there weren't just like, there wasn't a Coca-Cola was very popular, don't get me wrong, but if you lived in Chicago, you had lots of local soft drink choices to go with. And many tried to get into the yeast business, but by that time, Fleischmann already controlled the yeast market, the commercial yeast market. So there weren't a huge number of options, but a lot of brewers just said, the hell with it. You know, what, I've bought this plant that is no longer worth anything. And a lot of people simply sold while they could get something for this real estate they had invested in. But many, many, many beer makers had invested in all kinds of real estate. And I think the thing that separates the people who survived from the people who didn't was that they had real estate they could unload during the 1920s to kind of keep themselves going. Now, clearly, like the Miller family, my God, their real estate was always worth more than their brewery at the time. You know, they had gobs of real estate. Anheuser-Busch leased out part of its enormous facility in St. Louis so that other companies could use it. Pabst in Milwaukee actually rented out part of its facility to Harley Davidson, the motorcycle manufacturer. So there were things that you could do. And I think it was less than the big guys had more money, which yes, they did. But people who decided to stay in, like the family that is the center of this new book I'm writing, the Shell Marty family in New Ulm, Minnesota, they did have real estate, which, you know, they had been selling it off over the years because Minnesota went dry pretty early. They shifted to candy. They became a candy distributor, candy and sugar. This is a weird side note, but I can't resist mentioning it. In the 1920s, Americans really went crazy for sugar. It was insane. Candy and soft drinks became super popular. And one of the theories was that this was because people weren't drinking alcohol anymore. I don't know if that's true or not, or if just
you got to give up one addiction. You got to go for something else.
Right, exactly. So the people who made it were the people who just simply said, we're gonna figure out a way to keep going. And yeah, but even the Bush family, by that late 1930s, man, their bank account was running really low. So it was more a question of digging your heels in than it was, oh, we're big and we're going to survive. Because most of the breweries that did survive, they were quite small.
Yeah.
You know, Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, and well, Miller was a very small company at the time. So there were only a handful of really big ones, but of the 500 or so other who survived, it was just families saying, this is the family business and we're just going to try to hang on.
Sure. Yeah. During times of crisis, right, our government has historically taxed alcohol and tobacco. You know, I guess you could, you know, then people make a turn for sugar. I wonder if carbs had a rise.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. The sugar thing is really weird.
You talked about local soda in Chicago. There's a brewery, Schaenhofen Brewing Company, and they switched to making a soda, and it's called Green River after the Chicago River. And I think it's still around today, and I've never really had it. I'm not a big sugar person, but I hear it tastes like green Jell-O if it were liquefied. I know.
Each to their own. Yeah.
Okay, so 1920, 1933, Prohibition. What are some of the important components of us to finally get out of it? What happens? How do we take that turn?
It became clear that things were not working, and even people who had originally supported it, like the DuPont brothers, like John D. Rockefeller, these are some of the wealthiest people in the country. They had actively funded the prohibitionists to begin with, but by the middle of the 1920s, they realized this was just a disaster, and so they threw their weight into the idea of repealing. And the federal government commissioned a study known as the Wicker study, which just documents in painful detail the disaster that prohibition was. And when they released, that really energized the public. And in 1928, 29, brewers were working pretty hard to say, you know, let's get on board with this. Let's get on board with this. And then came 1929, and, you know, the market crashed in late 1929, but the actual effect took, you know, some months to really be felt. And by 1930, 31, and especially by 1932, it was clear that to get out of this mess, it made sense to bring alcohol back because it produced so much revenue and the country really needed that revenue. So it was like a cascade of events from about 1925 on that just finally, you know, tipped the tide in favor of repeal. And when Franklin Roosevelt ran on a platform that if he got elected, about the first thing he was going to do was figure out, you know, let's get this working, let's get this machinery cranked up so we can end this, so we can get back to this revenue that we desperately need.
This was his wet ticket. Right?
It was definitely a wet, yes, it was definitely a wet
versus
ticket.
dry. It's like West Side Story. Okay, so it happens. So one thing that I often get asked to towards the end of Prohibition is, do you know the dates of when actually they said it's done, right? To when it actually started. Now, this is where we're getting a little bit into why we chose to talk about this today. So how long does that take?
Okay, here's and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds because believe me, this can get,
I know.
so there's a lot of, so I'm giving you the simplified version of this. By late 1932, it was just glaringly apparent that one way or another beer was going to come back. I don't remember what the polling was for the two candidates running for president, but there was just a strong sense it was going to come back. So in 1932, in December, Congress held hearings to think about the mechanics. Remember, the Volstead Act set the alcohol, that's what defined a legal beverage as something with less than 0.5% of alcohol. So that was the thing that had to be modified. But the question was, if you're going to modify it, what is it that you're going to replace it with? So the transcripts of these hearings are really fascinating. By that time, there were two camps in the beer industry, one that wanted a 2.75 beer and another one that wanted a 3.2. And spoiler alert, the 3.2 crowd won out. But there were this long series of hearings, and weirdly, there were technical arguments made that 3.2% beer was not intoxicating, which is an argument that by that time had been made for 60 or 70 years, that it really wasn't intoxicating, and that you really couldn't make a real beer with anything less, that if Congress approved only 2.75%, that Americans would do what they had done during World War I, which was turn up their nose and go drink hard liquor instead. So there was a really hard lobby to get 3.2, and that had been decided even before this was, so I guess that was about a month after the election. And Roosevelt, back then presidents weren't sworn in until March. So Roosevelt's been elected, and it's just glaringly apparent we're gonna have beer. So the legislative stuff was going on from the time of the election until he came into office, which I don't remember what day it was. He might have been sworn in on like March 13th or something. I don't know, don't hold me to that. But true to his word, Congress, they had the stuff ready to go, right? I mean, they had made all these very complicated political decisions that involved taxation, what Americans would drink, how much revenue it would bring in. So when he asked on March 21st, 1933, Congress passed the legislation that would change the Volstead. This was not repealing prohibition. This was only to amend the Volstead Act from 0.5% to 3.2. And he signed it the next day on March 22nd. And in the legislation was a stipulation that on April 7th, so 2 weeks later, roughly 3 weeks later, 3.2% beer would be legal. And since brewers knew this was going to happen, they had already started, those who could get themselves cranked back up as quickly as they could, they started making the requisite beer and lagering it so that it would be ready to go. So there was a whole bunch of background stuff going on that went on for months that culminated on April 7th at 12:01,
right,
with 3.2% beer. Happy days.
So, okay, so on April 7th, 1933, people are able to drink 3.2% beer again.
Right.
The night before, April 6th, is sometimes referred to as New Beer's Eve, which is one of my favorite things I've ever read about. And this is one of my favorite parts of your book, by the way, the way you describe it, because you can just,
pretty cool.
You can just feel the excitement, right? So so basically what happens is, we know the beer is coming again. People are pumped, beyond pumped, right? Parties are being planned. Beers are being made, parties are being planned, elaborate ones at hotels and things. Can you just sort of set the scene on what's going on for New Beer's Eve, April 6th?
Yes, the term New Beer's Eve, we actually borrowed that from the Canadians. Thank you, Canada, because they had gotten their beer back in 1925. and they had a New Beer's Eve. So when it was the United States' turn, they just borrowed the phrase New Beer's Eve. The beer could start rolling, or, well, it could start being sold, but that meant first it had to get places. And so, by the way, only 19 states had legalized, were going with legal beer, because it's still, I can't stress this enough, alcohol regulation in this country is 90% done at the local level. So it was not every state in the country. And imagine most of the Deep South, no beer, and big chunks of the West and most of New England, no beer. But in these other places like Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Los Angeles, New York, the brewers are getting ready, right? And let me just interject this. People are pumped, not just because they get to drink beer, but because this clearly was going to help the economy.
Sure.
One thing in those hearings in late 1932 that the brewers stressed repeatedly was, they calculated, this is how much revenue you can expect. Here's how many jobs. People are going to have to make bottles. They're going to have to make wooden cases. Truck drivers are going to get jobs. It was the first really good news that Americans had known in about 3 years. So yeah, people were definitely psyched, and there were formal celebrations planned in, as Liz said, at hotels and so forth. But a lot of it was really spontaneous in Milwaukee, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in New York. People just showed up at the breweries. They just showed up by the thousands and thousands to just watch. And mostly what they saw were incredibly long lines of trucks waiting their turn to go up to the loading dock, get the beer put in it so they could take it somewhere. But it was a really big spontaneous party because things had been so grim for so long. It was April, spring was coming, and people were going to get to drink beer. And I think I kind of appreciate the sentiment these days, because let's face it, things are pretty grim right now, and I can understand just the sheer joy of knowing that finally something was going to happen.
Sure.
And FDR.
Yeah, we're barely in this, and can you imagine 13 years?
Oh my God. No, honestly.
We're all going to be at the brewery shaking the fences. Let us in.
Well, at least we've got alcohol, and I swear to God, I think the only good thing is that probably most states are going to legalize pot, and that just cannot happen soon enough. People are telling you. So it was. I've read a bunch of news coverage of places where people convened, and it wasn't like a bunch of spring break college kids. The crowds were orderly. Mostly people were just happy. People were not getting arrested for drunkenness. They were just happy. They were celebrating at any place they could, depending on what time they were allowed to get it. For example, in St. Louis and Milwaukee, you could get beer at 12:01, assuming someone had some, right there in the location. The president of the United States Brewers Association lived in New York City, and he did not want any mayhem. He did not want a circus. So if you lived in New York, you couldn't get beer until 6 in the morning. In Los Angeles, you couldn't get it until 7 in the morning. But just being out there that night, people don't have beer. Well, they might have been walking around with a, illegal cup of homebrew, or, I don't know, flasks of illegal booze, but people were just happy because it felt like the country was turning a corner from something that had just become eerily like what we're starting to go through. A third of people didn't have homes. A third of people didn't have jobs. It was, the misery was real. It was grinding misery. And here was evidence of a president who was willing to do something, who had plans. God, what I wouldn't give for a plan right now. And happy days seemed to be there. And so the party kept going for several days, because why not?
Why not? Yeah, why not? So the takeaway is that beer saves lives.
Yes, economies. I actually went and hunted up some statistics. At least I thought I did, but maybe I didn't. But we're talking millions of dollars that came pouring into see if I can find it here. I'm not very well organized.
By the way, everyone, I'm gonna ask Maureen maybe one more question, and then we would love to have your questions.
Yeah, well, here we go. In the first 48 hours of legality, the brewers had already paid $10 million worth of taxes. And I meant to look up how that would translate, but that's hundreds of millions of dollars translated into our dollars. Bottling companies had orders for millions of bottles. People, they were hiring people. That was the other thing. They were hiring people. They were making jobs. So the effect was very real and very immediate. You could
Right.
feel the difference.
So when we talk about what today or what we're kind of celebrating right now is really about the end of Prohibition and this idea of New Beer's Eve and what was to come. There is something that we now refer to April 7th as National Beer Day, which is a relatively new.
Yeah, I just learned about it yesterday.
Yeah.
Apparently there's a guy who is the godfather of, I forget his name now. There's some random Joe out there who organized this national.
Yeah, I think he was, if the story I recall, like 10 years ago, he was sitting in a bar and someone was telling him about this aspect of beer history and thought maybe we should have a National Beer Day and put forth the muscle to make it happen. And
he did.
I mean, you know, we kind of embrace everything that's all beer related. So National Beer Day has become a thing, but it's
and
a great
good day to have National Beer Day, right?
Sure,
I mean,
exactly, right, exactly. And one thing too that I always like to talk about when we sort of discuss Prohibition is everyone always thinks about the December date, right?
Mm-hmm.
The December 5th date, and you can drink all kinds of alcohol, but really this is a very important date. April 6th, April 7th are very important dates because it's really sort of the government saying, here you go, and we're going to wean you back to everything that you once consumed, right? So this moment in history is really something that, you know, almost for me personally, almost should be a little bit more celebrated than the December date for sure.
Yeah, and in December, what we're talking about is that the repeal amendment, the 21st Amendment, was ratified in December of 1933. So like 6 months after beer came back. And frankly, that day wasn't a particularly big deal. You know, I mean, it was nice, but like the sheer joy of knowing that the economy was starting to move forward was what really mattered in the end.
Right. Okay, so you guys, everybody out there, thanks again for being a part of this chat. Lucas, I'm going to leave it up to you if you want to unmute people. Totally your call. Otherwise, please ask questions. You can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question via audio, or if you want to ask a question in the chat room, please go ahead. And I'm going to scroll. This first one that popped up here, Maureen. Ken Burns' documentary series on Prohibition. Have you seen it, and what did you think of the approach?
I have not seen it. Sorry, I just haven't seen it. I'm sure it was great. You know,
I saw it. It was good.
Yeah. I mean,
typical Ken Burns.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I actually really enjoyed the national parks one better. Okay, let me see here.
It was a good question by Eric towards the beginning. It was somewhat answered. Eric, you're asking about what drove the anti-alcohol influence that eventually led to Prohibition, and Doug chimed in a bit about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but I think that's a really interesting aspect to touch on a little bit more, just the different factors and different motivations, and ultimately, in a sense, was Prohibition successful? I mean, it was really something of a social justice issue. That'd be interesting.
Here's my take on Prohibition in general. We are still, all these years later, what are we up to now? Like 85 years later or something like that. Somebody else can do the math. We are still living with a very long shadow of Prohibition. We have this cumbersome system for getting alcohol from the manufacturer to the consumer. In beer, it's called a three-tier distribution system. There now has to be this intermediary, the wholesaler, who over time became one of the most powerful players. When I was a little kid living in Iowa, there were only public state alcohol stores, and if you went to one, they actually had bars. You know, it looked like a jail. The clerks stood behind this big thing that looked like a jail cell, except we were the ones who were in the jail. And those laws like that stayed in effect for an extraordinarily long time. And the motive for finally trying to at least crack off a piece of the long shadow of Prohibition happened in large part because of what used to be called the craft beer industry. I have no idea what we're calling it now, but whatever it is. In the 1990s, and then right after the turn of this century, the new brewers really worked extraordinarily hard to lobby state legislatures to try to open up alcohol to the public, to make it possible, you know, to buy beer on Sunday, to make it possible to have more than 3.2% beer, to make it possible to have beer gardens, to make it possible to have a tap room where you could go in and get a beer. That is a subject that nobody has done any research in, but man, there is a great topic for a dissertation for somebody. The way in which the industry formerly known as craft beer really, for the first time since the 1930s, really made a dent in this long shadow. You can't make a dent in a shadow, so I'm mixing my metaphors here, but you get my drift.
Right.
We are still living with, in many ways, the mentality that brought alcohol to a halt. And even when Prohibition ended, brewers, it took decades to finally recapture anything remotely like the vigor that the industry had before Prohibition settled in. And the only reason it finally got healthier is because of the arrival of the baby boom in the 1960s. And suddenly there was this enormous demographic of young people, and they shifted their marketing to try to appeal to kids on spring break.
Yeah.
So,
or ladies in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Right? It's okay if you burn the dinner, but here, have a cold one.
Yes, yeah. So the long shadow of Prohibition has been extremely long.
James just piped in here, made a point that there are so many counties he's talking about Arkansas, but throughout the country for sure.
Yes,
we're still dry as a result of it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's not easy.
There are still some states in which you can't buy cold packaged beer. Ooh, I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know. That's a good question. I know in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's got some of the weirdest alcohol laws in the country. It's some weird thing like, you know, you can't go buy a 6-pack or some, I don't know now, I can't remember right now, but yeah, the law, again, it's extremely important to understand that the federal government actually has very little to say about who can drink when. And just like the federal government has very little say over who can vote when, local elections matter a lot. That is how
fascinating
happened in the first place, because they figured out that you have to start locally. And that's really where change begins.
Absolutely. Your vote matters, everybody.
Yes, it does.
Let's see. Okay, so one question about your, John piped in Wisconsin here, proving that, yeah, no kidding, Jesus. Okay, so one other question we have here is from Doug. Hey, Doug. Oh, no, we already mentioned your question. Rudy. Hey, Rudy. So right now you're writing a book about the Shell family out of Minnesota.
Yes.
And Rudy wants to know has the deep dive into the Shell family changed how you approach beer history since Ambitious Brew?
Yes, although it's not just that I'm using this family. I'm genuinely, I mean, I said to myself, how the hell do you keep a brewery going from 1860 to now? I mean, that's incredible. You know, the same family owns it. So that was part of it. But this is the first book, the one I'm writing now is the first book I've ever written where I actually know something. And I'm amazed at how much that has informed this book. And also, because of people like J. Nicole Beckham Jackson, and because of people like Liz, I am so aware now in a way that I absolutely was not, just how racial beer is. I mean, beer, the content of beer is very definitely driven by politics, meaning, you know, the alcohol content has always been driven. By the way, the idea that somehow back in the old days before Prohibition, everybody was drinking really heavy duty beer. I got news for you. From the 1880s on, because of Prohibition, the alcohol content was already drifting way downward. But it's also, I realize, and I'm so grateful for people like Liz and J. Nicole, the social construct of beer is an extraordinary manifestation of the way we think about race in this country. So I have really been thinking about beer in a very different way. At this point, I've spent, since 2002, I've been thinking about beer and writing about beer and watching beer happen. And so this book isn't going to be like the first book. When I look at the first book now, I can see its big flaws, you know, the things that I just didn't think about.
Do you, by the way, do you have I know that a lot of people hate this question, but do you have an idea of when your book is going to come out?
Boy, I'll tell you what, I wish it had come out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Part of it is that, my thinking has really, truly evolved in the last 4 or 5 years in particular. The Beer Summit really was just revelatory for me. In fact, I'll just tell everybody, I'm pretty sure that Liz is actually going to be the ending of the last chapter of the book. You know,
oh, wow.
She's going to be, you know, this is another way to think about beer. What I'm hoping, thanks to the virus, my grandson, who usually comes and lives with us in the summer, will not be here this summer, and I'm going to suddenly have way more time than I had kind of planned. And I finally kind of have a grip on this. And I've been writing this book backward. This actually didn't start as a book. It started as a 30,000 word essay looking at beer from 1978 to 2018. That's all it was going to be, because I didn't want to write another book, right?
Right.
And so I wrote that, and my brain just kept saying, you're missing something here. You're just missing something. And so I have really wrestled with this over the last few years, but God Almighty, I'm hoping this time next year this book is finished. By the way, I am publishing this myself as I published this myself, the revised
edition.
Because there, you know, in 2020, there's just no reason for me to give money to an agent and then have a publisher take my work for no money. I mean, they're not going to do anything except take my money. So,
right.
So it's all up to me, but that also means I'm doing the copy editing, I'm doing the proofreading, I'm doing all the editing, I'm doing everything. The only thing I'm paying somebody to do is make the cover, because that is a skill set I simply don't have. So I'm hoping in about a year.
If you haven't read Ambitious Brew, you guys, I suggest, and you're into beer history, I highly suggest you get it. New edited version, new book cover, fresh as can be. Let us end this conversation with the last question I see, which is really something actually quite interesting. Tim asks, how do you think brewing history has evolved since the publication of your book?
Oh my God, I could never, if by brewing history you mean the people who are attempting to write the history. When I was writing this book, one reason the first book took 5 years is because, you know, there just wasn't anything out there. And I was having to, I can tell you about every other day, I'd be like, God damn it, if only somebody had written a dissertation about this. And I had hoped, I genuinely hoped when that book came out that some people would say, oh, you know what, this is worthy of scholarly attention. And so actually everything has changed. There has been so much research done, especially in the last 10 years, really great dissertations, especially by Brian Alberts. You know, I would love to see that dissertation get into a book so that more people can have access to it. There's so much smart work being done, and we're all just going to keep learning more and more. You know, one thing I mentioned was the remarkable lobbying efforts on the part of the industry formerly known as craft, but there are gobs of other things that we now, you know, there's so many things. So I think it has finally become a serious academic scholarly endeavor, and that just, I can't tell you how good that makes me feel.
Yeah, and that's actually something we started with this conversation, right? With the whole idea that when you published your book, when I started doing my own research, I was doing talks at museums, the Chicago History Museum, and that was in 2007, and even then it was a struggle to get a museum to actually say, we're going to do this, because the whole thought of including alcohol in a cultural, educational museum setting was a massive no-no, because people thought, oh, you just want people to drink, right? And so it has evolved so much in the last, decade, I would say, for sure. I think it took a turn almost when you saw that second wave of breweries opening up in like the early 2010s.
Yeah, and the other, I don't know if people know about this, but thanks to some generous donors, the Smithsonian Institution has a substantive, serious beer initiative now, and their focus is really the craft beer industry. But I think that we can expect, as the years proceed, and hopefully more of these big money, deep pocket brewers contribute some more money, they'll be able to expand that. But yeah, beer has never been taken as seriously as it is right now. It's just, and even the one thing, when the book came out, I just started begging every time I got a chance to talk to a brewery or brewers. I'd say, please save your records. Sure. I know it's a hassle, but because that was part of my problem. Those breweries are gone, and their records and archives ended up, they've been dust for years, and years.
By the way, that's a whole other side to this that's happening, right? You have people like us who actually are going to do the research, but then you have new initiatives.
Yes.
Like the Smithsonian, Oregon State, North Carolina, right? These are actually people who are working with the brewing industry to support and keep those archives sort of on record, so that future generations are able to have access to those documents, which are so incredibly important.
Yes.
Smithsonian, doing great work. Teresa McCullough over there, part of our
Oregon State's archive is, I wish I had access. Those are the kinds of things that are going to change.
Yeah.
They have managed to get records and documents that I simply did not have access to, no way to even track them down, because it's expensive to do it. So there's way more to be said. In fact, I think it's so funny, not funny. At this point, my book, I think people are probably going to read it and think, well, hell, she doesn't know anything. This is kind of a dumb book. There's fantastic work being done. It's so gratifying to see that happen.
Yeah. And I am so thankful that people like Maureen are supporters of the Chicago Brewseum, which is an organization that is really trying to do a lot of this, take a lot of the historic academic research and translate it into more public programming, to one day hopefully have a brick and mortar location where we can do a lot more fun things. And it's people like Maureen, like I said, or Tia at Oregon State, Aaron at North Carolina, Teresa McCullough at the Smithsonian, who are part of a lot of our work. And if you go to the Chicago Brewseum website and look at our team, you'll see a lot of these folks being a part of what we're trying to do, and definitely have a sort of a solid national organization that's dedicated to telling the story of beer.
I think the Brewseum is actually hands down the most exciting thing going on. And by the way, everybody, is it next week you're going to talk to Travis? Tomorrow? Seriously, Travis Rupp is at Avery, but he's also on the faculty at whatever university is
UC Boulder.
UC Boulder. He gave a talk at the Brewseum Summit last year, and man, this guy is so smart, and it's going to be fascinating. So tune in tomorrow. He's going to talk about beer in the ancient world. It will be.
So tomorrow, I guess if you're Central Time, 4:30 p.m., we're having a late afternoon talk. Travis Rupp, who's the beer archaeologist at Avery Brewing in Boulder. He's also on staff at University of Colorado Boulder, and he's on our national advisory board. He's going to be doing a talk about beer in the world of wine in the ancient Aegean. So he does awesome work. We have a lot of these virtual events set up and coming up. So my suggestion, if you guys are interested, just go to our website, chicagobrewseum.org, go to the events page, and take a peek at what's coming up. Like I said, tomorrow night is Travis. Next week, we have Dr. Christina Wade, who is Dublin, doing a talk on Irish medieval beer history. And we have a little else, something that's actually not on our website yet. John Harry, who is actually on here today. John's going to be doing a talk for us on Point Brewing out of Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, there's lots of in the chat stuff. I'm trying not to read. There's a lot of useful info and links and so forth in the chat attached.
Yeah, guys, read the chat.
Yeah.
All right, Maureen, thank you so much.
Oh, Liz, thank you.
Joining us for a virtual talk today. Everybody out there, appreciate you guys supporting the Brewseum and wanting to learn about beer history and culture, being a part of it. Again, the takeaway is beer saves lives, and go support your local brewery during these times. And then after, when we're back at it, so excited to be in those tap rooms again and in those bars. I miss everybody I drink with.
Yeah, it's
sincerely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll catch you again tomorrow evening, everyone. Have a great night and drink that beer. Cheers.